I'm psychologist Dr. Bryan Violet, and today's guest is distinguished scholar and Polish history professor Bolek Biskupski. We'll be talking about traditionalism versus progressivism, the emotional dimensions of faith, the Ukrainian war, and Squadron 303, the Battle of Britain. This is the Catholic Center Show. I don't write things down on paper anymore. I think if I was born 200 years ago or 100
my
years
childhood.
ago, when I was born, if I was born at the same time as you, I would have failed. I never liked writing with a pen and paper or pencil. Certainly not a quill.
That's why it's so good to have serfs.
Yes. That's why I want to make more money. So I have to do less. My life
I already do less. It's called being a pompous goof.
All right. So this first question I want to ask you
Please.
might seem like a strange question. We can unpack it afterwards, but try and take it at face value at first.
As you wish.
When was the last time you thought about the Roman Empire?
Probably within the last 3 or 4 days.
You took the question very seriously.
I apologize.
No, it is meant to be serious.
I can tell.
And there was a popular meme on the internet about 3-4 months ago where women would go around with a phone and they'd ask their boyfriends or their husbands, when's the last time you thought about the Roman Empire?
Really?
And by and large, the women were shocked to learn that men think about the Roman Empire quite frequently.
Is that so?
Yes. Like, strangely enough, I mean, non-academics, just the average male might say, respond something like, not very often, why? And then the wife or the girlfriend would get more specifically, when was the last time? I don't know, a couple days ago. And the woman, they think it's the funniest thing, because they never think about the Roman Empire. And then I heard some commentary on this fad on the internet, which was that it's not necessarily the Roman Empire that men think of. It is, that's the content of it oftentimes, because that's one of the most salient periods in history. But there's just this space for reflecting on history in the mind of the man, and which is different than the female psychology. You've made a career out of studying history, and I'm sure you think about Polish history more frequently than you do the Roman Empire. I would
yes,
imagine.
a bit.
So do you have any thoughts about that? Why do you think men are drawn to the study of history?
It's practical. It seems to have use. It's full of fun and adventure. And it's sort of like taking a mental hike in the forest and looking for something to shoot.
Yes, we're interested in war and politics more than anything.
That's right.
It's interesting, in my field, men don't want to look at their own personal histories.
No.
But we want to look at history that's removed from myself.
That's right.
Perhaps there are things that I can learn about how to live my life well by exploring history.
Exactly.
So when you think about the Roman Empire, what do you think of? There was no Polish state at the time.
No. Well, usually when the topic of the Roman Empire occurs to me, it's for practical reasons, and that is I'm giving a course in European history that deals mostly with more modern events.
Yeah.
So I want to divide the previous era into logical subsections, and the Roman Empire fits in one of those. For instance, you say the Western Roman Empire fell in 476. It was the beginning of the so-called Dark Ages in Europe.
Right.
And the Western the Western capital of civilization died. It was replaced by chaos, which left only the Eastern capital, Byzantium, and nobody knows anything about Byzantium, which is ridiculous.
Yes. Why do you think that is?
Because it's in the East. Americans aren't interested in the East because it's not America.
And they're not interested in Eastern Europe.
No, not at all. And if they are, it's usually with contempt.
Yeah. So I find in my own mind that there is a space for history. I was a history major, obviously, and I was more drawn toward European history than American history. And I think in some ways that was because it's hard to identify myself as an American given my Catholic faith. It doesn't, there are American Catholics.
Yes.
Typically not very well received by Rome. There are American Catholics, but growing up, I mean, I was a history major when I was 19 years old. I mean, I didn't find a strong Catholic community growing up, and but Europe felt more like something of my own descent, right? That's where Catholicism was disseminated largely. It's like the seedbed for it. I mean, I know it comes, of course, from the Middle East, but it spread through the Roman Empire, essentially, via Constantine. So there was an association for me. Now I think the space in my history is reserved for Middle Earth.
Okay.
Do you like those kinds of fantasy stories? Do you like Tolkien? Or
I've read a bit, but it's been a long time. And when I make up nonsense, it's usually when I'm lecturing. That's because I've forgotten the truth.
So you think his book is nonsense?
No, not at all. It's charming.
Yeah. One thing I appreciated about Central when I was there was it was the first time that I discovered some space for an integration of faith and reason. Before that, as I said, growing up, I was Catholic. It was almost as if logic and reason was pitted against faith. And then when I saw that there were people, yourself included, who had an academic, intellectual mind, who still maintained a Catholic worldview, it was eye-opening for me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. One thing I noticed about your personality style when I was in school was it felt at that time it was the beginnings and the rumblings of an anti-conservative feel in the academic world, and I don't presume to know what your political leaning is. I know if you're commonly the Catholic faith, the values and the moral traditions of the faith these days tend to line up with a more conservative political standpoint, although not all of it, but some of the big hot button issues line up. But I could feel the tension and the pressure in the university at the time that pushed back against traditional values in general, Catholic for me in particular.
Of course.
And even the things today that are part of the culture war, I learned learned those theories I learned critical race theory in 2004. Now it's the big thing where everyone's arguing about it.
Absolutely.
Right? But these things have been in the academy. These ideas have been in the academy. But my experience with you was that you just didn't really seem to care. You were just really overt with your faith. You had no problem talking about it in class.
No.
Mentioning it. Have you ever felt that personal tension in you're surrounded by people whose viewpoints are very different than your own?
Well,
how do you navigate that?
It depends on whether we're talking about my positioning among my fellow faculty members and among the students, and it's interesting that this point will come up now because just yesterday, I guess, I was lecturing on European history when I got to the question of the European Romantic as a reaction against the Enlightenment. And I said essentially the Enlightenment is based on reason, and the Romantic is, whether it's admitted or not, based on faith. And I said as a consequence of that, people came to the conclusion that trying to explain everything by adding it all up and writing charts really doesn't answer a lot of the questions, like, this is the person I love. Why do I love her? I don't know.
There's a mystery in that.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
When I walk in the forest sometimes late at night, I feel strange things. What do I feel? I don't know. But they're there. Sometimes I'm worried, but I don't know why. Sometimes I feel relief, but I don't know why. You can't explain those because I can't either, and I'm smarter than you are. So consequently, those are acts of faith. If those are acts of faith, then you're a believer. And if you're a believer, and I said to the kids, you probably will try to get me fired, but I don't care. I happen to be a Christian. And as a consequence, what may appear to be an act of delusion by me, from your point of view, is to me simply common sense. Faith is reasonable. Ratiocinative process is insignificant by comparison. You explain life by basing your explanation in faith, not in reason. If you don't do that, then subsequent things like the law are just things you write down. You can erase them the next day. It doesn't matter. But if it's faith, if it's based on the dictates of someone very important like Jesus Christ, the most important person who has ever lived, then what he says probably will matter long after Thomas Jefferson is forgotten.
Sure, yeah. I noticed that the examples you gave that were reaction all began with "I feel." When you're talking about the Romantic period, it begins with "I feel."
Yes.
But you didn't label them as emotions, you labeled them as an experience of faith.
Right.
How important is the emotional life to one's faith, in your opinion?
It's difficult to divide the two. I think that, at least in my case, emotional reactions I very quickly link to faith.
Why is that?
Because it seems to be the most logical. It seems to be, yes, indeed. It seems to be the most logical. If you don't mind me wandering off into the muck here, I'm a Catholic for two reasons. One's practical, and one is grace. I'm Polish, and Poles are almost all Roman Catholics, as is my family. I did not grow up in a particularly religious family for generations. My family were from Warsaw, and they were members of the intelligentsia, which means they did things like art and music, and et cetera, violin, piano. And in my family, going back to 100 years ago, there were no Bibles in the house. There were no crucifixes on the walls. There were no rosary. I never saw a rosary. I didn't go to Mass. Nobody in my family went to Mass. All of us were baptized, I think.
Culturally baptized, almost.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was just something you do because that's what you do.
Yeah.
But urban Poles who considered themselves, Poles are very pompous, but pompous urban Poles really thought of being too overtly religious as being sort of silly. That's what peasants do. And so therefore Catholicism was just part of being what we are, but I didn't take it very seriously. It played a very small role in my consciousness.
Sure.
And then I came from a Catholic background, and when I was about 15 or 16, I decided to drop out of school. And I did. And I'm a high school dropout, of which I'm very proud.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I am. And I started dropping out in the 7th grade until the San Francisco Police Department was chasing me. And I eventually didn't go back in the 11th
All this
grade.
was in San Francisco. That's a whole other layer.
Los Angeles, too.
Yeah.
There were places.
Yes.
And since I was dropped out of school, I decided, well, I'm interested in things, and what will I do? So I read particularly a lot about Russian history and literature, and learned Latin and Russian, and which was an interesting experience. But after a while, I thought to myself, I'm reading a lot about Russian history, fascinating, but the Russians are frequently in contact with the Poles. The Poles are better. I'm a Pole.
Better at what?
Life. We're just better.
You're saying about pompous. What
you Brian, you use any word you wish. I thought at the first it was we're victim and it's their fault, and they've injured us many times.
Yes.
And we don't deserve this, and therefore
it's a long narrative, isn't it? Yes.
And so my interest in Russian history, very interestingly, came to almost a
like I want to understand my enemy. I want to understand the villain.
It was an experience whereby I thought to myself, why would I be interested in Russian history if in my study of Russian history I've come to the conclusion that the people who really deserve my respect and loyalty are the Poles.
Are your people.
My people.
Yes.
My people. The language I heard as a child, that not the crucifix.
Right.
But Poland.
Yes.
So as a consequence of that, and one of the reasons I eventually became a Catholic, not that I ever was anything other than a Catholic, but I was only a nominal Catholic.
Yeah. Like a reversion of heart, yes.
That's right. Is because, in some ways I could say, I'm Catholic because I'm Polish. I'm Catholic because I'm Polish. And sometimes people ask me, which are you more? And I said,
yes.
Don't ask me that.
The answer is yes.
Don't, it's yes. Don't ever ask me that.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a world in which Catholicism seemed to be a logical intellectual process by which I could identify with values and traditions which seemed not only reasonable,
more virtuous,
but inspiring.
Yeah, yes.
Inspiring. As I told my students just yesterday, a Polish cavalry charge
Yes.
is chivalry.
Yes.
And chivalry, you begin your chivalric episode by crossing yourself if you're a Pole.
Yes. There's something adventurous about it.
Oh, yes, yes. Cavalry is not just an armed force. Cavalry is an act of faith.
Yeah. There's a lot of trust required.
Oh, yes. And I said, remember the Polish cavalry, which I lectured at great length. I said the Polish cavalry never counted how many enemy there were. It didn't matter. It didn't matter.
So what was the driving interior motivation? The Polish nationalism, the loyalty to your fellow soldier, all of it, all one sort of what was that, storge? What's some sort of like loving friendship, loving transcendent value beyond my own life.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I'm as devoted to Poland as I am, is because Poland is probably the most traditionalist society left in Europe. And although it's becoming modernized now, unfortunately, there still are elements of traditional Polish values that hang on.
The last vestige.
Well, as I taught my son, I have two sons. I taught my young son, when you meet a lady, you kiss her hand.
I love that.
And you dip your head when you say that.
Yes.
You call a man sir, even if you're 12 or if you're 50. It doesn't make any difference.
Yes.
There's a dignity and traditionalism that makes me feel right.
Yeah.
That's
I think there is a call to in the culture, within at least conservative or the Catholic world, to return.
Yes.
To return to that type of honor.
Well, exactly. The notion of Catholicism as being the last defense of tradition. Yeah. In this case, an intellectual and faith tradition. But I would also remember that. Remind you that you need to be reminded. I'll tell you that Polonism is based on the elevation of tradition to a virtual faith level. There's even a saying, what should you be? Polonais chrétien. You should be a Pole, a Christian, and a gentleman. If you're that, you're living the right life. If you're not, you're a failure.
And they're on the same level.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You know, so when did this emotive dimension to your faith start to develop?
As I said, this was the practical aspect of my, shall we say, conversion, and that is my realization that the Poles are the more attractive and the more admirable community, and one of the things that is formative in the culture of Poland is Catholicism. Without Catholicism, Poland is not Poland. So I think my pathway to Catholicism, one was the fact that it was my realization that Catholicism and Polonism are inseparable. And it's the traditionalism of Poland which makes Catholicism absolutely vital. Because Catholicism is part of being a Pole. The idea that you would join this sect or that sect and wander about and there'd be 50 different churches on their block, it would be absurd to a
So Protestantism hasn't really taken root?
No. No. There were a few Protestants in Poland in the 16th century, but it basically disappeared very, very, very rapidly. And in Poland...
What was the bulwark against that? Why do you think that is?
Because Poland passed legislation in 1573 called the Warsaw Confederation that said you may be of any religion you wish and have all political rights. So you could be a Protestant and you could be elected to office, you could do anything you want, whereas in the rest of Europe at the time, they're slaughtering each other for the wars of religion. There were no wars of religion in Poland. None. You can say I'm very proud of being a Pole. And so therefore, if you could be a Lutheran if you wanted, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And people who were Lutherans for a generation, they finally said, well, why would I want to be something other than...
The rest of Europe, it was bound up in some kind of reaction to the oppression.
Exactly.
And, it was a psychological dimension.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Virtual civil war going on in England, the wars of religion going on in Sweden or France, or something like that. There are no wars of religion in Poland.
Yeah.
None. Does that mean the Poles are always nicer than everybody else? Well, yes. But
we've established that they're better.
Oh, so. Of course. There's no question about that.
Yes.
But I think it's the tradition of religious toleration with the one that it explains in part why Protestantism was never popular in Poland.
Wow.
Never.
It's very interesting.
Never. You could be a Protestant, so therefore you didn't want to.
Yeah. Yeah. So the emotions, when did they start to become more a part of your faith?
This is already moving to dark waters.
Usually emotions are.
I think so. Let me tell you a story.
It's an interesting association we have with emotions and water. I'm drowning right now. There's a flooding.
That's right.
It's like the cognitive and intellectual exercises give us they elicit themes of stability, right? Control, right? And the emotional life can sort of flood its way in and drown us to where we lose control.
That's right.
So we have that association.
Yes.
So dark waters.
Dark waters, indeed. And it's, as I say, I'm ask you to indulge me. I have a strange story. When I was, since I grew up only very nominally Catholic, and never went to church, nobody in any of my family did, etc., etc., I was very much enamored with atheism, because it seemed to me that the people I knew were Catholic were just not particularly well educated, and they just said these things because their mom and dad told them to say these things, and they really had no idea what the consequences of what they were saying were. So they were, to put it very simply, they were simply stupid.
Well, that actually is a problem with faith development anyway. You do need to make it your own and not just adopt your parents' faith.
And therefore, for me, Catholicism, I dare say, it would have been the same what I'd been talking about, Orthodoxy, for instance, were not only not intellectually impressive, but they were sort of silly. And therefore, I became not only a devout atheist, but I became a proselytizing atheist. And I found that Catholics were the easiest to attack because they had the worst time in using rational argument to defend their faith.
Yes.
They were easy targets, and it was fun. It was fun to destroy them.
Yeah. I wonder if there's less need when you start to sort of have all the answers. Because you accept the Lord's word.
That's right. That's right.
You stop seeking.
Yes, because you could ask them, why are you doing this and not doing this? And they couldn't answer.
Yeah.
Because they accepted it on faith and it never occurred to them why they're doing it. So they had their religion lacked the rational basis that is necessary for faith. Yes. Ultimately, faith requires faith, but it also, you can't be faith based on stupidity.
Yes. So
this was my view, and I think the most important day of my life was fast upon me. I was up very late talking about the impressive qualities of atheism and the stupidity of religious belief, and I was about to go to bed, and as I walked towards my bed, suddenly, all at once, I had an epiphanal experience. And it was this: there is a God. There's no question about
mystery.
That. Yes, it's no
mysterium.
All the argument that there is no God is wrong. It's just it can't be. It's wrong. There is a God.
Yes.
Not only that, but since there is a God, since He created the world, it would only be reasonable to assume He will want to maintain His link with the world. He want to have an ambassador, and that would be Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And Jesus Christ is our link to God.
Yeah.
And if Jesus Christ has an ability, and He does, to maintain this linkage and spread it, He would need an instrument. And thereby, thou art Peter.
Right, yeah.
And upon this rock.
Yeah.
So the Catholic Church is the church. And without the Catholic Church, the logic of the existence of God is done a great deal of damage. So from that moment, I went from being an atheist to a believer, to a Catholic, to a conservative Catholic, and for all practical purposes, a monarchist. And I did that in less than 15 minutes.
A monarchist?
Oh, yes, I was.
The benevolent ruler, that type of theory?
Not really.
Political theory?
My political views are, if I say I'm a conservative, people start thinking of someone like Donald Trump, and that couldn't be more wrong. I'm a conservative in the sense that I'm a traditionalist.
Yeah.
And I regard populism as boorish and vulgar. But I think when I say I'm a traditional, I mean I want to maintain traditional values and practices, because without those, society will and is falling into ruin.
Yeah, there is this idea that if I could trust the king, if the king is Christ, or some approximation of the king, of Christ,
yes,
and then I can trust him to serve me with his rulership, what's wrong with that? The issue is if the singular person in the position of monarch is fallen, which we all are, but or is corrupt. I mean, there are gradations of what the expression of fallenness means. Then the temptation is to throw out the idea of monarchy or any government for that matter, right?
Of course.
And, I mean, in the ideal, if any government is populated by saints or Christ, they all sort of work, don't they?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, when I say monarchy, and I do it almost tongue in cheek, I don't mean I'm looking for a wonderful fellow to be just a great king and conquer France. That's not what I had in mind. To me, when I say monarchy, it's the concentration of traditionalist values in a way that makes those values comprehensible and maintainable. So it's not that I want George to be king. It's the fact that I want a world in which tradition are fundamental to the existence of society. Because if you dispense with tradition, you're doomed.
Sure. And how do you situate the idea of progress within that worldview?
Be careful. Be careful.
But not against all progress, obviously.
No. But as a friend of mine once said, is all progress progressive? And I'm not so sure it is.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I mean, theology has progressed, one might say. I mean, if it has that core kind of center that's in line with magisterial teaching of the church, I mean, it has developed in terms of our understanding of what God has revealed to us. I've been chomping at the bit a little here in listening to you talk about how your faith was in some ways intellectual, but there is a emotional development to it. In order to introduce the topic of John Paul II, who, in all the gifts that he has given us, has given the church, the foundational philosophy is the Christian personalism, which is an integration of Thomism and phenomenology, which is all about experience. Now, if it's just experience, right, this is Shaler, the philosopher Shaler, then I get to determine what is right and wrong and good and evil and true and untrue. And it's all that matters is my experience. But when it's balanced against, well, God told us this and we can trust it, right, then they come together. So that my experience matters. I want my experience validated, but it cannot exist apart from the teachings of the church. And that was his great contribution philosophically. And then everything else was built on that. That's what we have the beauty of something like theology of the body, where we learn about how sex between a husband and wife is really a reflection of God and the soul. It's a sign of that love, of that eternal love. And all these wonderful things that he contributed. He's a very psychological pope, and he loved the emotions. And much of what we do at Catholic Psych is built on his Catholic anthropology. He was a Pole.
Oh, yes, very.
The second greatest, besides yourself, of course, that I can think of. There's so much, I think, to be said about him. What is do you have a devotion to him? Where is he in your
oddly
headspace?
As is the case with so much of my relationship to religion, politics, etc., my understanding of Polishness is very profound in this. To me, John Paul was the Pope, but he's also a profound Polish patriot.
Yes.
And you can see this in many of the things he said and did, and the way he looked. When he talked about Poland, often there were tears in his eyes.
Yes.
Because
emotional man.
Oh, very emotional man. And a Pole's love for Poland, if he's a true Pole, is very emotional. Yes. It's not rational. It's not English. It's not American. It's Polish. Who else is like that? Maybe the Italians.
Yes.
Maybe the French.
Yes.
Scandinavians? I don't think so.
No.
Well,
I think the Italian nationalism, the Italian pride comes from a long period of the need to come together and protect oneself in a provincial way against the outside world.
Exactly.
At the level of village, and then eventually at the Italian state, and even Italian Americans.
Right.
And how they were when they came here. There's a strong Italian American nationalism even now, mostly because Italians were the only ones you can trust. Right.
Well,
your locals. Even at the family level. That's why we have the unhealthy guilt trips. You're not allowed to leave the house. But yeah, that it does take shape in certain cultures, and I think Italian is also one of them.
The Italians, you mentioned, I think quite correctly, a sort of the element of paranoia as in its positive fashion. If you feel that you must stick together because you're in danger,
yes,
then increasingly you look upon your fellow Italians, in this case, as family. There's even a Polish expression, for instance, wszyscy Polacy jedna rodzina, all Poles, one family. And if you don't have that, facing great challenge is impossible. There must be unity, and the unity must be based on faith. You don't say to somebody, "Explain to me why you're Polish."
Right.
Don't ask somebody. That's ridiculous.
Yes.
I am because I am. I'm Italian because that's what I feel.
Yes.
And it's not. Does that mean it's not true? Of course it is true. It is true. I'm a Christian because I believe, not because I read something interesting recently.
Yeah.
Although I might have. But I've noticed since paranoia is one of my hobbies, I remember a few years ago an interesting. This is going to be probably, the sarcasm will probably be bothersome to people, but it occurred to me that if you look at the way certain groups are presented in Anglo-Saxon, I mean literally British and American culture, there's an interesting pattern to it. Whether it be we're talking about the English or the Americans, the French are effete. They've always lost all the wars. The Americans had to save them in World War I and save them in World War II.
Yep.
The British really are their superior in every way. The French are just really silly people. They drink a lot of wine and they dress peculiarly and they're effete. The Italians are ridiculous. They wave their hands around a lot, and they've never really accomplished anything except, of course, the Roman Empire. But we usually forget about that. And they're basically emotional, silly people who eat food that you really don't want to eat.
These caricatures, yeah.
Well, exactly. So the French are secondary. The Italians are secondary. The Poles are stupid, and for a generation we were told that.
Yeah, you know, the first joke I ever remember learning as a child was, how do you get a one-armed Polish man to fall out of a tree? Wave.
Wave. Well, some of these are funny, but it's.
But why is that? I mean, even I know that you've talked about in some of your work.
Sure.
Well, I want to get into this later as we talk about the film, but the genesis of this anti-Polish sentiment in the United States and in Western culture, probably. But you know, I'm talking about the 80s.
That's right.
And I'm Polish.
Yes.
Yeah. My grandfather looked just like John Paul II. My mother's maiden name was Kuzic. And so you know, I'd laugh at the joke, but then say, wait, why are Polish people stupid? What do you mean by that?
But if we contextualize the Poles, note what the Anglo-Saxon psychology, historical psychology that we're creating here. All the people of Europe who you think of as being, frankly, ridiculous are all Catholics. Who were the brutes who created the Inquisition and slaughtered people in vast numbers, these cruel, dark, Jesuitical Spaniards?
Right.
At the same time, of course, the British were killing people in their own country in numbers that are quite, some estimates would say in the late 16th century the British killed 20,000 Catholics and 50,000 Lutherans. The Spanish did nothing like that. So who are the real religious butchers in Europe? The English.
So do you think this is because, extending even today, British imperialism has controlled the narrative?
I think it's in... I think the religious guidance of Anglo-Saxons, whether they be English or Americans, is practicality. And they see Italians, Spaniards, Poles, the Irish, of course, are worthless drunks. They see them all as frivolous and silly, who must be controlled.
Well, they're not emotional.
No, they're not.
The British.
No, not at all.
And Catholics do have space for the passions.
That's right. That's right. And I think there is a very profoundly embedded notion that if you are from the rims of European culture, you're either from the British Isles or across the ocean in America, Canada, and of course Australia, New Zealand, and going the other direction, you are a person who is capable of really anything because you have practical values, you have focus, you have managerial skills, etc., and therefore you have a right to be the leaders of Western civilization. The other members of Western civilization are simply, they're almost clowns. And although, as Churchill once said about the French, they've invented a lot of cheeses, the whole idea is they have their good moments, but basically they're not. They're not. And that's why making fun of Poles, making fun of Italians, looking upon Irish as stupid drunks, calling Frenchmen cowards, when what you're saying is absolutely wrong. It's not true. true.
Yeah.
But you're saying it. Why? Because you need to say that to yourself.
Isn't there something though that's attractive from a male perspective about the stiff upper lip of the British culture, of the regular? It's Aristotelian, isn't it? It's the control of the passions. It's the capacity to modulate what I'm feeling and be stable and secure and not let ourselves be drowned by the emotional life. So I think there is, like, James Bond, I mean, is stoic in a way.
No, yes.
And emotions are associated with the feminine, typically. Now, we could unpack that quite a bit. But I do think there's almost like a superficial attraction to British culture and the British way of looking at things. Maybe just for Americans, and that's why we have the cowboy, right? You know, it's the stoic Clint Eastwood type that that doesn't feel, that doesn't emote, and then we have the masculine construct that permeates all of society. I mean, boys don't cry. I mean, that's still common. And there's pushback against that now, and in some ways it's gone too far. But there's no virtue in the mean of this integration, the integrated self of listening to the emotions, letting them move you, their locomotive, right? But you don't let them make decisions for you either. You do. It is Aristotelian. It's the rider on the horse. You listen to the horse. You're kind to the horse, but you don't let the horse drive you off a cliff, right? Like you are in control ultimately. Not to use the word poles again, but I think people are drawn to poles and have difficulty with both and. It's very Catholic to consider the both and. Christ is fully God and he's fully man, right? We're saved by faith and works. You know, the both and is hard for our mind.
Oh, yes.
And we tend to shift one way or the other.
No, I agree. I think it seems to me that there are aspects of Anglo-Saxonness which are purposely and consciously, perhaps increasingly unconsciously, it's propaganda. It's propaganda. It is to present a picture of the Anglo-Saxon people by which they are always not only virtuous, but they really are always victorious. The others have their moments, to be sure, but in the long run, it's the practicality, the good sense, the managerial skills, what the British called positivism in the mid-19th century, the philosophical doctrine behind capitalism. All these things seem to be nothing more than common sense. Capitalism, after all, is a much better system than socialism, because socialism doesn't work. It's basically another way of getting towards tyranny. So that's just foolish. So you have capitalism, and capitalism requires democracy to make capitalism more functional, and capitalism is based on the presuppositions of positivism. Now that all sounds fine until you realize what is the ultimate next step if you follow this process? Atheism.
Right.
Atheism.
Yeah, positivism specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you look at the major proponents of positivism in the 19th century, whether it be Darwin, for instance, or whether it be Spencer, all of them, even some of them simply lied. They're all atheists.
Yes.
They're all atheists.
Yes.
And they saw religious faith as being darkness. And the people were cloaked in darkness because they were too stupid to realize that they're being held back by faith.
Yeah.
And only when they jettison faith will they be able to climb the hills of progress and be liberated,
Enlightened
in some way.
Yes.
And that's why, of course, what do you want to be? Well, you want to stop being Catholic because Catholicism is stupid. You can't be Orthodox because the Orthodox are simply Halloween creatures. They're just ridiculous.
Yeah.
You don't want to do
bells and smells and all that. Yeah.
It's just nonsense. Protestantism is okay for a while as long as it's cooperative.
It's neat and tidy and
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you can fool with it on the edges.
Yeah.
And then you have what you really want, which is Anglo-Saxonism. So in order to make sure that people don't think it's a lousy version of being a Frenchman, what you do is you simply remaster history so it comes out with you're the good guys.
Right. So this to me makes sense from a British perspective. But the complicating fact is that Americanism is a watered down and a version of an Anglo-Saxon viewpoint, and it's increasingly less British as time goes on. In fact,
British is less British.
What's that?
I say the British is less British.
British is less British, you're right. But I mean, as I said before, I could never identify with American history because it didn't feel like my history as a Catholic. But I mean, you are Polish. And,
I'm a
and
Pole.
there's identity, and I'm sure you're a Polish citizen. I'm sure, right?
Yes.
Yes. But you're an American citizen,
Yes.
right? So it's getting more and more complicated in terms of what it means to be American. You can't draw a straight line from the average American to this Anglo-Saxon tradition anymore. I think it's it's foundational. There's especially Puritanistic types of sentiments and philosophies and implications, and all that is embedded in the way we look at the world. But what do you make of the fact that you're also American? How do you make sense of your American
I'm a Pole
identity?
who was born in America. That's where I'll end the sentence.
That's the end of it.
That's the end of it.
So you don't identify with American culture.
No. No. When I don't dislike the Americans, and what I always say is this: I was born and raised in the United States. I know the United States quite well. I obey American laws. I pay American taxes. And whenever I'm abroad, which is quite often, I always defend the United States against those who would attack it.
Sure.
Because I think the United States has many virtues, and they should be properly presented and defended. But
It's the land of opportunity. We're here doing this right now.
But at the risk of being excessively emotional, my heart is in Poland. And whenever I go to Poland, the first thing I do is I say, whether I'm alone or with one of my family members, we're home.
We're home.
That's home.
This does not feel like home. It never has.
This is a hotel.
I wonder how many Americans feel that way.
I don't know. I think more Poles, and not only Poles, Italians, Frenchmen, Irishmen, really are more French, Italian, Irishman, Polish than they want to admit to.
American.
Yes, I think this hyphenate is Polish Americans. I will never use that word. I don't like it.
It's so complicated though, because it's complicated because of the blending. I mean, I'm not purely one or the other.
Sure.
And I do identify with the cultural heritage of multiple European states.
Of course.
And it's hard to get behind one particular just sort of national bent.
Of course.
You know, and I think that's most Americans. And then with each generation, there's more of a mixture and something that is becoming like unadulterated Americanism is now rising to the top.
Well, it's an interesting paradox, and that is assimilation, whether we're talking about the United States or we're talking about Bulgaria. Assimilation is inevitable. If you move into a culture that was originally not your own, in order to function successfully, you have to understand that culture and function within the confines of that culture. If you don't, you're a failure.
Right.
So therefore, learning how to be Bulgarian, if you're from Serbia, is necessary to be successful and to be at peace.
Yes.
So assimilation is simply good sense. I understand that. But recent studies on immigration history have indicated that people in the fourth generation, usually it's referred to as a fourth generation phenomenon.
Yeah, sure.
It occurs, they're disturbed because in their...
They're divided.
They're looking for rootedness. What am I? Am I nothing?
Yes.
And a lot of these people want to travel back to Norway or to France or to Greece because my great-grandfather was from there and his name was so-and-so.
Yes.
And that's what I originally was.
That's where I belong.
That's where I belong, or at least that's what makes me me.
Yeah.
Because if you're not me and you're just nothing, I don't think it's enough.
No.
I don't think it's enough. I think a person has to feel, you can say, well, what about his faith? Can't you say, I don't care whether I'm French or Italian. I'm a Catholic. And that's enough. Well, maybe it should be. Maybe it should be.
But it should be. I think it's harder for the Poles, as you mentioned. That's all one identity.
It's one identity.
Yeah. I did have a friend. I met a friend in graduate school who was from Rome. And I was in the D.C. area at the time for graduate school. And there were a lot of like Midwestern Americans that come there, and I just didn't jive with them. Being from the Northeast, it was very different culturally. in terms of how we expressed ourselves, how direct we were, how emotional we were. I didn't jive. But my friend from Rome, who was Italian, it was like that. I don't know what it was. There was an Italian-ness that brought me back to my Aunt Thomasina's house growing up as a child. And I was Italian-American, and he was from Rome. But there was some kind of, like, I mean, almost mysterious way in which we connected that I can't even articulate.
Oh, I understand exactly what you're saying. Since I run the Polish Studies program, we have a lot of public events. There'll be dinners or meetings of some sort. And when I walk into a room,
I feel it.
I know who is mine.
Yeah.
And we walk over to each other, and usually we start speaking in Polish.
Yeah.
And then, oh, you're one of mine.
Yes.
And I'm one of yours.
Yes.
And I can count on you, and you can count on me.
Yes.
And I don't feel that way towards anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's hard for the American experience is that I can say part of myself can experience that with different groups, right? So I do have a Polish side to me. My father is Swiss French, and my mother's culturally Italian. We have the Polish dimension of my grandfather's side, and it's like where do I belong? And I think the only answer nowadays is, well, I'm Catholic, and I can at the very minimum connect with people on a Catholic level.
Yeah. There's an interesting story about this. I think it addresses several of the points that we've been discussing, and that is, this happened in the 1930s, and there was a well-known Polish scholar from Krakow, from southern Poland, who went to visit a colleague of his, a colleague of his for many years, who was an Italian who lived in Rome. And the Pole was being taken around Rome by his Italian friend and shown the sights, et cetera, et cetera. And the Italian, very proud of the fact that he was not just an Italian, but Rome was his home, turned to the Pole and said, "I'm a Roman." And the Pole looked at him and said, "So am I."
Yeah, that's funny. The other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of John Paul II and Poland, I'm not sure where I learned this, and this might just be might just be dipping our toe in spiritual language here for a moment. But I thought it was a very helpful way of thinking about the spiritual life. Like, this is a microcosm for what can happen to all of us spiritually, but it happened at a national level in Poland. Was that there's just so much suffering. The Polish people have experienced so much suffering that in that space, the only place to turn to is the cross.
That's right.
And born out of that tremendous suffering was John Paul II. That he would not have been a gift to the world had he not suffered in his nation with those people in that very particular way. And, whenever I get discouraged about American culture, I'm reminded of him, because what we've seen historically is that things change because of just one saint. I mean, Francis, John Paul II, and everyone in between.
That's right.
And the whole cultural landscape can change because of the holiness of one person, which does include a dimension of martyrdom too.
That's right.
So do you see John Paul II, in some ways, the spiritual fruit of the suffering of the nation?
Yes. He represents a tradition that has a very interesting historical rootedness. Poland was destroyed at the end of the 18th century, the so-called partitions, when all of its territory was occupied by foreigners and Poland lost its freedom.
There was no Poland.
There was no Poland for 123 years.
Yes. And
if you're a Pole, suddenly you have no country, and you basically are a citizen of nothing.
Right.
There's nothing.
No rights.
Nothing at all. And in fact, not only do you have nothing, but you're under considerable stress. In some cases, a great deal of stress. So a philosophical movement developed in around 1800, next several years, called Polish Romanticism. And what Polish Romanticism did is not only say, boy, we were really great and important and we did wonderful things, aren't we a great people, we've got to never forget that. Well, that's fine. But went farther than that. And in the work of certain poets, it said, wait, we were just partitioned, which means our territory was divided.
Yes.
And we died as a result. But you're still here. and I'm still here, which
Right.
means we're not dead. And therefore, what's the last thing that was ever done to death so it could arise again and be great again? Jesus Christ.
Right.
So therefore, Poland is the Christ of nations. We have been martyred. We are the martyr nation. We are the select of God. Only the Jews can share this with us. We are the chosen people. And this notion, you read about this now, it's almost frightening. It's presumptuous. It's moral presumptuousness. There are Germans and there are Italians and so on and so forth, but only Poles are Poles. We are God's chosen people. And therefore, we are punished because of our greatness, just as Christ was crucified because of his enormous significance. So our punishment is really not a sign of God's rejecting us, it's a sign of his love.
Is it because of our greatness, or is it the identification with Christ always means crucifixion? Or are those
question.
are they different? I mean, maybe they're the same thing.
I think they're pretty much the same thing in that although a lot of the people who were so-called Polish romantics, their Catholicism was not traditionalist. In some, I would say, even it's questionable. But I think what they did is they saw the New Testament as a explanation for what would otherwise be a pretty frustrating reality. We're ruined. We're nothing. We're ridiculous.
Right.
Could we just accept that and say, oh, what the heck, I think I'll be French? Or do we say, there's a reason for this?
Yeah. I think there's mystery here, too. The Paschal mystery, more specifically, which is that from the darkest place, God can draw good. And going back to our thoughts earlier about the both and, in my work with clients, if there's some kind of trauma that I'm helping them process, I've heard some horrific stories.
Really?
You always want to make sure that you validate how terrible that is, full stop. That's always terrible. I'm not going to try and make you feel better via religious, spiritual platitudes. I mean, I think that starts early on in a Catholic culture. Right? Oh, I'm really upset about something happening. Offer it up. Your emotions on how you feel don't matter. Just make it spiritual. And there's nothing wrong with the offer it up dimension to it, but to invalidate the emotional life is problematic. And so let's acknowledge that this is terrible and it's always terrible. Sin is terrible. Separate lane, God can draw good from that. And the Paschal mystery tells us that the worst thing that could possibly happen already happened. We killed the Son of God. And from the worst thing ever came the greatest good, right? The resurrection. But it's mystery. We call it the Paschal mystery. And we think about how that happens in our lives in a longitudinal way of death and rising, but even day to day. These terrible things that happen to us, our frustrations, our difficulties, our sins, our shortcomings, our pain, God still draws good from those things. As long as we maintain both lanes, the mystery connecting them, I think, is in God's hands. So when I think of the Polish experience and how many Poles have been trampled on, the nation has been trampled on, and as a result, we have some of the most vibrant, it's the last vestige in Europe of a Catholic faith. Yeah. I mean, I don't know exactly how that adds up, but I don't know if it's purely rational. I think there's some mystery in those realities both being true.
Yeah, I think so. Well, the idea that good could come from bad, or there's light in the darkness, we're telling ourselves something that we should always understand, and that is cliches are the source of wisdom.
Yes.
If you're really going to learn something, listen to cliches. Don't read Aristotle.
The wisdom of old wives.
There you are. I think. I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
Have there been times when you think that you were in direct communication with God?
Yes.
That you thought you heard something that was effectively his voice?
In my mind, yes. And in my heart, yes. I think there's two ways in which I experience communication with God. I think one is that. I think of Our Lady and the Rosary. And the promises to St. Dominic, and one of them is signal graces. What is a signal grace? Where God makes known to you his plan for you through the experiences of your life. And those moments where it's like, there's no way that is a coincidence. That is, not just that, but these 9 things in a row, like make it very obvious to me that he is telling me something. Like it could not be arranged. Like things are arranged such that I had to know that I'm communicating with him. So there's 2. I think there's one I think there's a danger, a psychological danger, in just believing that we can text God and have a cup of coffee with him, because discernment is a complicated process. But yes, I do think there are moments in which we can receive these signal graces and have an interior experience of God's communication with us that let us know what he wants of us, what he's asking of us, or sometimes it's just kinder than that. I'm with you.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because it corresponds to something that happened to me relatively recently. A few months ago, after some medical processes, there was a suggestion that I might be very ill, very, very ill. And after considerable testing beyond that, I was told suddenly our original understanding was false. You're not gravely ill. You're not really ill at all. You're going to be fine. And it was extraordinary. And I remember going home and saying to my God, why? Why did you save me? What have I ever done that would cause you to intervene to save me? This is all your work. What do I do to repay you for saving me? And God's voice said to me, and it wasn't a voice with the thundering clouds, etc. No.
Go on Brian's show, he said.
Yeah. Well, of course. But he said the next day. But in a perfectly normal voice, the way you might say something like, this is a bus stop or something. He said, for the rest of your life, every person you ever meet, be nice to him. I said, that's it. That's it.
That's easier said than done.
That's it.
Yeah.
And at first I thought, well, that's all you want? You don't want me to throw myself off a pyre or something like that? And the next day I thought, when I go to a grocery store, I'm going to make jokes with the cashier.
Yes.
When I walk across the parking lot, I'll help an old lady with her cart.
Yes.
And people start coming up to me and say things like, oh, you seem to be a nice guy. It's a nice suit you wear. I said, thank you. Your suit's wonderful too. God bless you.
Yes.
And I started that a few months ago. And if ever I meet somebody, if he's not happier after I meet him, I've failed. And it has changed my life.
It's beautiful.
Because I try to make everybody happy.
Yes.
I at least try.
Experience his love.
That's right.
We are a vessel, right?
He saved me to do this, and I won't fail him. At least I'll try not to.
Yeah. It reminds me of some thoughts that Chesterton gave about St. Francis. When he said, most men do not see the man for the mob. Francis never saw the mob for the man. So every single person that he encountered felt as if they were the only person on earth. That he would give his complete devotion and attention and love them as best he could in every single conversation. Which, on a broader level, we have this idea that Christ would have died just for me. That's hard to wrap your mind around. Just for me, like you're thinking about just me, as if no one else matters.
And if you say, "Well, I deserve it," then you're going right to hell.
I must be special.
Yes, it's called satanic, but
yeah.
But this is something that's come over me just as I say fairly recently,
beautiful.
And it's changed my life because I feel different. I feel that it's my job to get up in the morning and ask myself, what am I going to do today? Who am I going to see today? And make sure that any encounter I have, every encounter I have ends more positively than it was before.
That sounds dutiful. Do you feel happier also?
Yes. Oh, good Lord. Quite literally. Good Lord. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I feel younger. I feel more energetic. And I'm always happier. And every so often, and the times are not that far apart, something happens that's good or satisfying, and I thought, he's saying, good job so far, Bolek.
Yeah. Yeah, you have a personal relationship.
Yeah, and the idea that there is no God, or that I don't have this relationship with him, absolutely impossible. I have no doubts.
It's so difficult, I think, sometimes Well, you can't convince anyone of faith, right? It is really a question of a personal relationship. You can't argue in favor. I mean, you can make the argument that it's supported by reason. Faith is supported by reason, but if you have different presuppositions, you could make the argument that he doesn't exist at all. And I would understand that. And the way through that dilemma is to say, well, it's about a personal relationship with God, a personal relationship with Christ. But even that, like, what does that mean? I don't think people know what that means, and I don't think I can even explain it well, but I know that I have one, you know? So all very, very interesting. So let's talk about this film.
Let's talk about this. This was a pornography the two of us saw together in downtown, wasn't it?
I don't think they have those kind of theaters anymore.
Gosh. Oh, well.
Yeah, so I think the lead in here to discussing the film is to talk a little bit about your personal interest. And I don't mean just in Poland.
Oh, sure.
But I mean on an academic level. As I had mentioned to you before we started recording, that I saw a lecture of yours from 2010, many years ago. But you began the lecture talking about how why you were writing the book that you wrote about the attack on the Polish people and Polish culture by Hollywood. What motivated you to write that went all the way back to your childhood and seeing your grandmother
and my mother
and your mother cry because Poland wasn't mentioned and the Polish people weren't mentioned in relation to World War II.
Yes.
This film that you had me watch, which, by the way, I was a bit confused because you said you don't like any films in the last 70 years. And I was like, wait, this wasn't that long ago, this film.
You forced me.
I was delighted.
Oh, good.
But in some ways, this film, to me, seems like a victory for that boy.
Yes.
Tell me about your love of this film.
The film is simply put the history of a Polish air squadron defending England against German attack in 1940 in the early stages of World War II.
Yes.
The squadron known as 303 Squadron was extraordinarily successful and played a disproportionately large role in protecting England and in regaining the pride of the Poles. Pride is a very important theme here. And the Poles came from a series of terrible steps in World War II, and they found themselves in England, and the English treated them like dirt. Because from the English point of view, you were invaded by the Germans, you lost.
You failed.
You failed.
Yes.
Then you were helping out in the defense of France, you failed. You've really contributed nothing, you're a bunch of stupid Catholics, literally. And as a consequence, we really can't expect much of you.
And in fact, we're going to use you for the meat grinder.
You're fodder.
Yeah.
The Poles are fodder.
Until we train up our own pilots who are better.
That's right. And the fact we treat you this way is justified because we're simply doing the logical thing. We're superior, you're inferior, we use you, and the good guys win.
Well, this sounds like a Nazi
doesn't it?
Standpoint.
Doesn't it? Yeah. And what the film does, and the film is remarkably accurate. And virtually every one of the characters mentioned is a real historical character.
Yes.
And the events were taken from the diaries and other recollections of participants.
Yes.
So it's even though it's an emotional film, it's very accurate.
Yeah,
it's very accurate.
It feels different. It doesn't consist of a Hollywood narrative.
No.
With the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the typical kind of narrative.
Right.
It's almost like just snapshots. Of important moments.
Right.
And sometimes you go back a couple years, and then it's difficult to weave a story through it. And I didn't know, as I was watching it, I had to see where I was in the movie. There's only 10 minutes left. I didn't feel like a typical story. It was a historical film.
Yeah. Well, it's in terms of organization and other aspects of film, it has its flaws. It's the chronology is extremely difficult to follow. You seem to be jumping back and forth.
Do they expect every viewer to speak all of these languages?
Oh, that's right. And there are no subtitles. So therefore, there are scenes, fairly lengthy scenes, when all of the dialogue is in Polish, or all the dialogue is in German.
Thank goodness for closed captions now.
That's right.
I wouldn't know.
That's right. And so that's part of. But I think why I suggested you see this film is not because it presents the Poles as heroes. I'm a Pole. I want to be shown as a heroic people, and these are our heroes, etc., etc. No, there are subtle aspects that are below the surface in this film, which I think is interesting.
Many.
Yes, and one of them that's most striking, since we're talking about things Catholic, is midway through the film, the Polish pilots are in are stationed in Nordholt in England, and the Poles realize that the English would be uncomfortable if there was a crucifix on the wall of their barracks.
And perhaps a Marian icon.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they distract the British soldier, and while he's distracted, they nail the cross to the wall. And I thought, what could be more eloquent than telling the world, we're different from you.
Yes.
That matters to all of us. And you have the cross on the wall, and then Our Lady of Częstochowa is the most important icon in all Polish history.
Yes.
She's everything.
Yes.
So not only does he have the cross, but he has the particularly Polish Catholicism.
Yes.
Indicated
And the officer responded well.
Oh, he did.
He said, who is she?
Yes.
Yeah. She's been with us since training.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's an indication of, shall we say, the profound significance of Catholicism. These are soldiers. Soldiers have to have their God.
Yes.
Their Catholic God.
Mm-hmm.
And then also in the film, there are scenes where they're in a tavern or something like that, and when a Polish airman is introduced to somebody, he kisses her hand.
Yes.
And sometimes the English are obviously uncomfortable about that, because Poles have been kissing women's hands for probably 10,000 years.
Oh, the women loved it.
Oh, the women loved it. Absolutely.
Yes.
And this is looked upon by the English at the time as being something that's so old-fashioned, it's sort of ridiculous.
Yeah.
But the Poles don't care, because Poles kiss women's hand as of 48 hours ago. I kissed a woman's hand.
Yes.
So we still do that. And why do we do it? Because it's what we do. And if you don't like it,
yes,
I don't care.
And we're united together in that.
That's right.
So that empowers us to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So it's our old traditions, our values. Forget about heroism and things of that sort. It's the traditionalism, the faith, the practices, the relationship to others, and the cocksure attitude. Do you notice in the film repeatedly, whereas the British are represented as being very well organized and stable, the Poles, by comparison, are sort of cocky and fun-loving and goofy, and they do what they do.
More human.
Very, very human. And they find the English rules to be sort of
ridiculous.
Yes. And this is, I think, a profound difference between the American British mentality and the Polish mentality. The Americans and the British sanctify law, and you live by law, you live by rules. That's progress. Yes. The Poles look upon law as something that's occasionally convenient, but sometimes not.
Well, it's the spirit of the law.
That's right.
What is the law designed to enforce?
That's right.
Yeah.
So you do what you think is best, and if it doesn't agree with your rules, who cares?
Right.
Who cares?
Right.
We're just going to have fun. We're going to be jaunty, but when push comes to shove, we're going to be there.
And you think of the difference in their style in the air.
Yeah. Oh,
the structure and the formation and the enforcement of that, and the reprimands when some of the Polish pilots deviated from that in the beginning, until they realized, oh, maybe if we let the Poles fly in loose formation.
Yeah, exactly.
It just reminds me of like the Revolutionary War, of all the British soldiers just lining up.
Yeah.
And why they lost in America.
That's right.
Because the militias were just moved to the side.
That's right.
It's as simple. The rigidity is their undoing.
Yeah, I think that you hit on a key point here, and that is the way, it sounds very abstract, but it's not. The way you engage the enemy in the air is either by close organization, the British and later the American practice, or you swarm all over them like crazy people. You aim your plane directly for them, and you are in effect telling them, you're going to turn before I do.
Right.
And if you don't, I'm going to kill you.
Yes.
And if you don't turn, I'll crash into you and I'll die. But it doesn't matter, because I have to kill you.
Yeah. I also saw in the air combat the real kind of support of the pride of each pilot among the Poles. Go chase him down. He's yours.
He's yours.
And no one would tamper with that. In one case, there was one where the pilot sort of went off the reservation
Yes.
a bit and came back later. And his punishment was, well, you're not going to have a wingman anymore. You're still flying with
right.
us.
That's
because
right.
because you can't go that far away from us.
But it's interesting how those comments in the film reflect on what our earlier part of our conversation is. Do you remember the portion of the film where the King of England is congratulating all these Polish pilots for their contributions to the war?
Yes.
And virtually every one of them has a non-Polish name.
Yes.
And there's a Czech, there's a German, there's a Russian, there's a Swiss, but they're not. They're all Poles.
Yes.
And the king says something, which, by the way, he really did say, that's an exact quotation. He said, being Polish is a state of mind. And the people he says that to are all Polish because they want to be.
Yeah.
And my hero is Józef Pilsudski, great 20th century Polish political figure.
Yeah.
He was Poland's national hero. Some people would say the creator of modern Poland. He didn't have a drop of Polish blood. He really wasn't in Poland until fairly late in his life. He was Lithuanian, he was Belarusian by ancestry. He had no contacts with Polish, shall we say, racial at all. But he was the most passionate Polish patriot in all of history. Why? Because he loved Poland.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a Pole.
Yeah. Beautiful. Another subtle thing that came to my mind too was it was very subtle. The critique of Nazism was there, but it was very subtle.
Very.
It was two scenes that come to my mind. One was when the very adept German pilot
Yes, very.
looked at the newspaper and said, how come they're in England, their pilots are on the front page, and for us it's only the Fuhrer?
Yeah.
And then the response was, do you have something to say?
Yeah.
The other pilot, the young, brash pilot, do you have something to say against the Fuhrer? So that was one. And then later, after all they went through, and they're in the hospital, and this guy can barely, he can't even move.
No.
And dispassionately, a record is sent to them. It's not even from the mouth of someone, which criticizes them for failing. They're in the hospital, giving up their lives for Germany.
But they lost, I'll say.
But they lost.
Yeah, that's a very clever way of pairing those two Germans. One is a German patriot, no question about that. He risks his life for his country constantly, and he's a very quality soldier. But he's a German patriot who detests Nazism. Yeah. Because he's an aristocrat, and Nazis are peasants.
Yeah.
Though they're worse than peasants. They're scum.
Interesting.
They're populist scum.
Yeah.
The other one is a Nazi. What his social origins are really don't make any difference. He's just a thug.
Yeah.
And he wants to kill people because he's for racial superiority. And the gentleman has Poles whom he respects and speaks very highly of and regards them as worthy of him.
Yeah.
And always acts in an honorable way. He's a German patriot. Well, I'm not a German patriot, but he's an honorable man. The Nazi is not an honorable man. He's a murderer.
Yeah.
And they're telling us not all Germans are Nazis.
Yeah. And you see the friendship between the two most skilled pilots, the Cobra leader of the Poles and this German pilot.
Yes.
And when this political tension surfaced in the room, he said, times are difficult for friendships like ours. Well, I thought that was so skillful.
Exactly.
I loved that line.
Yeah. There's an interesting scene in that when the Nazi of the two Germans, the Nazi is lying in bed, obviously grievously injured, and his right arm is held up in a sling, and he's bandaged, and obviously it's in a Hitler salute posture because of his injuries.
Yes.
But when the other German who looks upon him with really he doesn't have any respect. He's crazy. He's a crazy Nazi. Yeah. He literally goes by and snips the cord and the swastika, the salute, the Heil Hitler salute falls to the ground.
Yeah.
That the symbolism of that is you're
very well done.
I disdain you.
It was very well done.
It was.
So I have another question.
Sure.
I don't know how deep into this rabbit hole you would like to go. But I was thinking about the lecture that I saw in your book about why the Polish involvement and the Polish heroism in World War II was erased, not included in Hollywood culture and in film, and the reasons for that, the need to not anger Russia at the time, and because of, there was I think part of your argument too is that Hollywood was run by Jews, and Jews had difficulties with the Polish people at a time, and some of those reasons during that time in history. Okay, full stop. I've also felt, even now, even today, it does feel like Poland is left out of the international conversation. We do have a war going on. And I don't often hear about the Polish perspective of that war.
No.
What does the world need to know about the Polish perspective in terms of what's happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians?
Well, we immediately confront one problem, and that is psychologically the Americans, no matter what happens, no matter when we are isolationists. And for the Americans, foreign involvement may initially capture your imagination and passion. It quickly fades from that.
When it becomes expensive.
When it becomes expensive, when it's distracting. If you tell an American we're going to send this amount of money to Ukraine to help the war against the Russians, often you'll get an answer like, but we could take that amount of money and we could do something here domestically. And therefore, why should we send it to a place we don't even know where it is? Where is Ukraine? It could be in Kansas. It doesn't make any difference.
Sure.
So why should Americans send their hard-earned money to places far away, populated by people who are slightly ridiculous? We're going to do that at our own expense. Why should we sacrifice for other people? And the more east you are in Europe, the more likely the Americans are to disdain you.
It becomes more pronounced.
Exactly.
Yes.
So therefore, it's one thing helping the English, and maybe the Irish. The French, that's a little tougher. But to make sacrifices to help a Romanian, a Ukrainian, a Pole, it's like helping someone on Venus.
But hasn't American support come basically to Ukraine from, like, through Poland?
Yes. Yes. Actually, the American sacrifices for Ukraine are not as great as they seem, because a lot of that has gone back into American pockets. The real sacrifices, again, this is Pole patting himself on the back, the real sacrifice for Ukraine has largely been from the Poles.
In what ways?
Always. In money, weapons, and taking in Ukrainian refugees. There are up to 2 million Ukrainians living in Poland now. Poland doesn't have the capacity to be able to house 2 million people. Imagine if you, the relative number of those compared to people crossing the border into the United States, it would be an interesting comparison. The Poles have millions of Ukrainians who are in dire shape that they have to take care of. And they're not a rich country, but they're doing it. And they are, in some cases openly, in some cases secretly, helping the Ukrainians. And they are the most passionately pro-Ukrainian people in the world. And you have to understand that Poles and Ukrainians traditionally detest one another. So for the Poles basically to tell the Ukrainians, let's let bygones be
But they detest the Russians more, don't they?
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, one of the reasons that Poles traditionally detest Ukrainians is because they reconcile with the Russians and the Poles didn't. And from the Polish point of view, you stabbed us in the back.
You betrayed all of us.
You betrayed us. You should have been with us, and you went with them. And the Russians killed at least 4.5 million of you between 1932 and 1938. And doesn't that tell you something? So I think the Poles are hurt by the fact that they think that they should be recognized as playing a more important role, especially in European affairs, than the EU, for instance, is willing to grant them. And the Poles, for instance, have said repeatedly, the Germans destroyed much of Poland. It has never given us a penny back. The Germans who slaughtered the population of Warsaw in 1944 during the Rising, not one of them was ever put on trial. Many of them had good jobs after the war. These are monsters. They killed innocent people by the thousands and tens of thousands. And yet you let them get away with it. Why didn't you, the Americans, why didn't NATO, why didn't you punish these people? And the answer is because we're the victims and you're not. And to be very blunt about it, you really don't give a damn about us. It's as simple as that. So Polish martyrdom again. And there's nothing more arrogant than being a martyr.
More arrogant than being a martyr?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the Poles are very arrogant.
In the sense that one would use their suffering to control others, to manipulate others?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So then what? So with that knowledge, how might it be helpful for the world to know about the Polish involvement in the war?
How that could be done is difficult to say, and the situation is changing day by day because we don't know how the war will look like in a month, much less how it will end.
Yes.
If the war ends with a Ukrainian victory, which is my prayer, or was at the very least a settlement that both sides can tolerate, Poland's situation, in my estimation, will be improved. Because Poland will have played a large role. The Ukrainians will look upon Poland as their most important ally, and the pathway for Ukrainians to NATO and to the EU will be through Poland. And therefore, Ukraine will become an inevitable Polish ally. And to be very crass about it, add up almost 40 million Poles with 40 million Ukrainians, 80 million people. They're one of the largest countries in Europe. In other words, it would be a very significant center of power.
Yeah.
If Ukraine loses the war, God knows what the Russians will do to them, but Poland will immediately be in danger.
Well, hasn't now I'm out of the game, but hasn't much of what's transpired exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the idea of Russia as a military force there's been some holes poked in that.
Oh, yes. The idea that Russia was alongside the United States, one of the two great military powers in the world, now is looked upon as mere nonsense. Yeah. The Russians, according to the latest estimates, have lost 300,000 men, which is roughly the number of people the Americans lost in all of World War II. So the Russian casualties have been.
You miscalculated a bit, huh?
Yeah, it's been.
The Ukrainian resolve. Yeah, I think he miscalculated the Ukrainian resolve.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Ukrainians have done better than the Russians thought was even remotely possible. But I think obviously it'll be there's something going on sort of below the horizon that is very interesting, and that is the Poles are members of NATO. They're members of the EU. That means if Poland is invaded by another country, NATO will come to the aid. It's called the fifth factor in NATO.
Yes.
However, the Poles know that they can't count on NATO. They know it.
Yeah.
Why would they? So therefore, the Poles have concluded that the only way Poland will be safe is if Poland can protect Poland with nobody else. And therefore, the Polish military is the most rapidly developing military in the world, with not only number of weapons, but the quality of the weapons. And just recently, a year or so ago, the estimate was that if Poland is invaded by Russia, Poland will last weeks. Now,
not so much.
No. In fact, there's even suggestions that if Russia invades Poland, Poland will win.
And with a depleted military.
Yeah.
Because of having to get through Ukraine.
Right. And because they've been spending so much money on weapons. That sounds fine. It helps Polish self-glorying, but self-glorification. But it's disturbing because what it is also telling us is NATO is so important and the EU is supposedly so important to the world. Why don't the Poles trust them? Are they paranoid? Maybe. Are they right? I think yes. And if you can't trust NATO and it's a military alliance, who can trust NATO? The British can trust the Americans. Beyond that, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
The EU, the EU is as an economic, cooperative economic bloc, is good for everybody. The EU, by embroiling itself in the internal workings of every country, by literally doing something like editing the school books in country schools, by penalizing them for domestic legislation, for laws passed, is undermining the sovereignty of its members.
So they become the world police, right, which attacks the principle of, subsidiarity?
Yeah. So the Poles have long ago regarded the EU as invasive and damaging to Polish national sovereignty and Polish national self-respect. And therefore, they don't particularly like EU, but they'll never criticize it openly because, frankly, they need them. They need the money of the EU for Poland to be successful.
Yeah.
But a lot of people in the United States, for instance, criticize Poland for not being more pro-EU. But here we have the church issue. From the point of view of Poland, the EU is too modern. And the EU is always talking about modern values. And frankly,
And Poles are traditionalists.
that's right.
Yeah.
What is a modern, to this day, I don't know. I've asked my students, what is a modern value? And if it's modern today, will it be modern tomorrow?
Well, I mean, modern increasingly means postmodern, which is the deconstruction of all institutional norms.
That's right.
Yeah.
Modern is the enemy of tradition. But with this, tradition knows where it's from and therefore has foundations. Modern is just a step into the darkness. You don't know where you're going. You have no idea. And you could change your mind tomorrow, and what was modern today will be regarded as no longer modern tomorrow. It's just chaos.
Sure. Wouldn't the pushback be, though, that, I mean, there are mistakes that have been made within tradition?
Of course.
So we need to learn from those mistakes. And what else but modern progressivism attends to those errors?
Well, yes, I think criticizing and correcting errors in traditionalism is necessary. It's fine. But the question is, on the basis of what critique will you evaluate traditionalism?
Sure.
And in the case of modernism, it's not as though this is the traditional way of doing things. On the basis of these views, we will now improve the situation, because there aren't any these views.
Because that's always changing.
Because that's always changing.
Yeah.
So it's in my estimation, it's ridiculous to tell someone that this traditional behavior is not longer acceptable, because in comparison to what you're doing, you should do, well, whatever this is, but I've forgotten what it is, because we are someplace new now.
Yeah. It reminds me of something you once said. It's probably a good thought to close on. I'll never forget this.
Oh, thank you.
In some way, I think what you're pointing toward is how progressivism in some ways devours itself over time, because there's no there.
That's right.
And we look at one of the ways in which modern progressivism, which is antithetical to traditional values, specifically Catholic values, is that it results in only one or two kids. And over time, guess what? You're not going to have the vote anymore.
That's right.
And something you once said, someone had asked you, I don't remember who, it was probably the Emperor of the World asked you, because these are the kinds of lunches you have, asked you, advice would you give to the Poles? And you said, have more babies. Do you recall that?
Yes. I've told some of my students, especially those who speak Polish, ojczyzna potrzebuje dzieci. The fatherland needs children. Because if the number of children being born, especially to the better educated and more successful class of the population, if those numbers fall, the nation is committing suicide. It can never recover.
Right.
And why would you do that? Because life without a family, you live with nobody. Why marry? Why would you do that? Because relationships can come and go. Why the nonsense of marriage? It's just ceremonial rubbish. Why do that? So if you don't have children, really, do you need to marry? Right. If you don't need to marry, does that mean you have a girlfriend this week and next week you have a different girlfriend? It just becomes social chaos.
And your worldview dies with you.
And it's based on nothing.
Right.
It's just wandering around.
Right. Meanwhile, Catholic families are having 12, 15 kids,
Well, it should be 18 to 20, I think. I have 5. I wish I had 10.
Yes.
I wish I had 10.
I hear that over and over and over again. No one ever regrets, as they get to the winter of their lives, they never regret not making enough money. They often regret not having enough children.
Exactly.
I wish I had more.
Yeah.
Because you just, when everything fades away, because money comes and goes, success comes and goes. Yeah, as you get older, you realize that having more children is important, because as you get older, I'll speak for myself. I get balder, dumber, fatter, right? And the only thing that remains is the love exchange. That is the only thing that is eternal. And those you can only find those. I mean, well, you can find it most frequently within the family system, if it's a healthy family system. And you can find it in some friendships, but ultimately it's the only thing that matters.
That's right.
So having more babies, creating more people who share the worldview that we espouse, is ultimately the long-term answer to a culture war.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. As you get older, and everyone does, the idea of moving into old age all by yourself,
It's terrifying.
It's not only is it terrifying, but it's stupid. It's stupid.
Yes.
Why would you not want someone to talk to you?
Yes.
Why would you not want somebody to walk up to you, slap them on the back, and say, let's go out and have some fun?
Sure.
Why would you want somebody you can go on a trip with? My youngest child is my son. He's 17. We go to concerts together. We go to plays together. We're going to go to Poland together. We've done that twice. And he's my son. He's my buddy, too.
Yes. I think people, modern parents, think that parenting is only friendship.
Yeah.
Maybe traditional parents, there was no friendship.
Yeah.
But it can be both. There can be
both.
a hierarchical dimension.
Absolutely.
But there's friendship, and there's us together gazing out into the world alongside one another.
Exactly. You don't lower yourself till you lose your parental dignity. You don't do that because that hurts him.
Yeah.
He has to know that you're the father. You'll always be the father.
Yes.
Not just a buddy.
And no one can help that.
No. But you have to let him know. I've told my son repeat. I said, Stash, his name is Stanislav Stash, you can always count on me. I will never fail you. Never.
That was my Polish grandfather's name.
Really?
Stanley.
That's the most Polish of all names.
We called him Stash.
Yes, that's the patron saint of Poland. That's the patron saint of Poland. And he knows that. I said, Stash, it's Joseph Conrad, the novelist, once said, do you know what the only real Polish virtue is? Loyalty. I said, I'm loyal to you, and I know you're loyal to me.